I hope we didn't scare everybody else off last week, but we're going to pick things up tonight about halfway through chapter 11, and my goal is to kind of finish up Daniel tonight. But we're going to begin tonight with an opening prayer. Lord, give us faith to believe that despite what our eyes see and the troubles that plague our lives now, you are still in control. Teach us to trust that everything will end in glory when by your grace we inherit a new heaven and earth and live with you in eternal bliss. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. I think we're going to probably begin with chapter 11, verse 36. I think we had gotten through verse 35 last week, and through much of chapter 11, we've been hearing about these two kings, the king of the north and the king of the south, and how they've kind of been going back and forth. And toward the middle part of chapter 11, we begin to hear about how the northern king keeps coming down and attacking the southern king. And just by way of a reminder, if we think about the eastern edge of the Mediterranean and Egypt down here to the south, the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, this would have been kind of the area of Syria, and this would have been the area of Egypt. And sandwiched in between would have been the Promised Land. And really the only way to attack one or the other is to pass through the Promised Land. And so the kingdom, the king described from the north and the south, they're going at it, back and forth. It's a kind of an ongoing turmoil. And the prophecy of Daniel 11 is about to just kind of blow up and get bigger. Clearly, the story as he tells it matches actual history from about 500 to about 150 BC. I mean, it just matches it so well that, remember last week I read that paragraph by the Bible critic that said it matched so well that it had to have been written after the fact. So certainly the words that we read last week really had the northern king and the southern king in mind, and near the end where we kind of left off, we're probably somewhere getting close to I think it was like 168 BC, and the king in the north was Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was the king that was definitely in view. And over the course of his reign, he made 4 major incursions down and into Egypt. Sometimes quite successfully, other times not so successfully. And sometimes on those unsuccessful trips, on his way back, he kind of took out his frustration and hostility on the Jews, God's Old Testament people that were living in and around Jerusalem. These would have been those who had come back from Babylon, from the exile. But before we dive back in, I want to pose kind of a fundamental question, and the answer is very important in how we understand these types of prophecies. So what I have in mind here is something I call an eschatological. That's a fancy word for last day stuff. But prophecies that look ahead to the last days and to the last day. We sometimes describe those as eschatological. And so the question is, why does God give us these types of prophecies? And I've given it to you in the form of a multiple choice question. So, does God give us these prophecies so that we can figure out when the last day is going to be? Well, if you were inclined to think that was right, don't. That is absolutely not the reason He gives it to us.
Nostradamus does that for us.
There you go. You have to look elsewhere for that kind of stuff. And if you think about what Jesus tells us about when the last day is going to be, and Jesus makes it very clear, nobody knows. No one knows. Not even the Son. Demonstrating how unknowable this is for any human being. So anyone who looks at these prophecies and begins to try to figure out when it's going to be, they're off on the wrong path. They're just on the totally wrong path. Could it be He gave us these things so that we could identify key individuals or governments or kingdoms? Probably not, because the very nature of these prophecies are such that you don't fully recognize them or understand them until they happen. And when you think about looking ahead into the future and describing it in terms that you could understand, we can take something very, very simple, like telephones. And so if God had given Daniel a vision of phones, how would He have described it? Well, we might expect Him to say something like, well, it's an electronic device. Well, they don't know electronic. So you might get, well, they're a thing, and it sits in your house. It hangs on the wall of your house. And sometimes it rings, chirps like a bird or something. And then you walk over to it, and you pick it up, and you talk into it. And then you can hear somebody else talking from anywhere around the earth. Now, we would go, oh, he's talking about a phone. But to an ancient, it's like, what? What is he describing? How could that possibly be? Now let's step it up a notch. How would Daniel have described a jet aircraft? Oh, well, let's see. There's this thing like a giant bird. Like a bird the size of a whale. And it's made of metal, brass or iron or bronze. And it flies through the air and it holds people in its belly. The people back then are going to look at him like, you're nuts, you're crazy. And so there's just an inherent challenge, especially in any prophecy that looks a long ways down the road. To talk about, yes, this king, he will rule, and he will put his generals all around the globe. Well, in the ancient world, all around the globe would have blown their little minds. Right? The world was still flat. And we kind of take that for granted. But if you begin to explain this, and then they actually put these tools up in the sky where you couldn't see them. I'm talking satellites now. And they tracked weather and they took pictures so we knew. They would have no earthly idea what we were talking about. And then we come along and we begin to read these things. Oh yeah, we know exactly what they're talking about. Oh yeah, we know exactly. Well, we might know how it looks in our day, but we have no idea what is still coming down the road. And everybody is looking for the one Antichrist. But we know from Scripture there will be many. And so if we think we know one or we've seen one in our own day, we have no way of knowing if that's the last one or if that's the great one. We just don't know. So it's not for that reason. Which, by inductive reasoning, we can then jump ahead and look at D and say, well, we know it's not D. And so the only choice left is the correct choice. These prophecies are given to comfort and to encourage God's people who will be living in these times. He gives us a glimpse at the end so that we need not despair about what's happening even in our day and age. And if we can keep that in mind, I think it keeps us from making some other mistakes about how to kind of consider and think about these prophecies. It also, I hope, keeps us from wasting a lot of time on details that we A, can never figure out, B, maybe have no idea what they are anyway. So we just don't have to sweat them so much. Like, what do certain number of days mean? And we don't have to sweat it so much. Because we want to keep the goal is to comfort and encourage God's people that despite how bad things look, He does remain in charge. And He knows how it will end. And He's going to give us a glimpse of that to calm us down a little bit. Kelly Stolte had her baby this morning, little boy. And I think about women as they prepare to give birth for the first time. You could be told about it, you could have seen movies about it, and all, but still, I would expect it would have to be kind of a scary thing. And yet, when it's all over, not that big of a deal. You kind of understand how everything works. And yet we tell our young gals what to expect so that when it happens, they won't panic. And God is doing the same thing for us here. So we're just going to jump back into the vision in verse 36 of Daniel chapter 11. And if someone wouldn't mind reading for us, we'll read from verse 36 all the way to 45. All the way through the end of the chapter.
And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. Shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished. For what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these, a God whom his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. And those who acknowledge him, he shall load those with honor. He shall make the rulers over many, and shall divide the land for a price.
And I'm going to stop you there, Mary. I take it back. We're just going to pause there for a moment. These last 10 verses of chapter 11 really become difficult because up until this point, the kings and the rulers from about 500 BC to about 150 BC, they fit this story really, really well. And in particular, Antiochus Epiphanes. It fits so well. There could be little doubt this was kind of the initial fulfillment. But beginning in verse 36, the description doesn't quite fit anymore. The king shall do as he wills. Well, in a sense he did, but he didn't do completely as he willed because he didn't win every time he went down to Egypt. And when he heard that the Romans wanted him out of Egypt, well, he turned tail and ran pretty quick. So it no longer quite sounds like him. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god. Okay, he's maybe still guilty of that. And he shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. Yes, he hated Yahweh. He wanted to destroy the worship of Yahweh. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers. No. He embraced the Greek gods, the gods of his fathers. This doesn't sound much like him. He shall not pay attention to any other god. No, he very much was mindful of the Greek gods. He wanted to destroy the God of the Jews. He wanted to wipe out any remembrance of him. And yes, he did magnify himself, but never to the point of putting himself above all the Greek gods. And so the text just doesn't quite sound like that. And a God whom his fathers did not know, he didn't invent gods. He was very much a Greek in that sense of the word. And so it all begins to get a little bit too big to just be fulfilled in the person of Antiochus. Okay, Mary, then would you finish the chapter for us?
At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and with many ships. And he shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and silver, and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him.
All right. Now notice the very beginning of verse 40. What time is in view here?
The end.
At the end. Now, could it be at the end of his reign and rule? It could be, but again, it almost feels like it's getting a little bit too big. And then there's a little bit of an issue with the referent here in verse 40. At the time, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind. Well, does that mean he's rushing upon the king of the north, or is this a new king? Is this a king who is neither the king of the south or the king of the north? You know, is this looking beyond that time in human history? But don't miss verse 45. Yet he shall come to his end. Right? So whoever the king is, if it's Antiochus, his time will come to an end. Or if it's something bigger, that too, we are assured, will come to an end. And there's actually comfort there for God's people. This persecution, it's not going to continue forever. God will decide its limits. And God will bring it to an end. Kind of an interesting, in verse 41, Edom, Moab, and the Ammonites, they shall not fall. Well, we need to remember, these are the enemies of God's people. These are the quintessential enemies of God's people. And the king, whatever king this is, isn't interested in harassing them. Why? He's already got them. Right? They're already in his... This king is going to want to wipe out all of those with the knowledge of the Lord. Those are his enemies. This isn't a king that's just out to be king over the earth. This is a king that has as an objective something much, much larger. Not just an earthly kingdom, but something even larger than that. And then in verse 42, he will stretch out his hand against the countries. The land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and silver and all the precious things. So this probably is too big to fit Antiochus. He doesn't command all the wealth. Remember, he's turned back from Egypt on one of his last attempts. The Romans come in by sea, and when Antiochus gets back to Syria, he probably gets an email from Rome. And Rome says, that's it. We're tired of you running around exerting your influence. See, by the 2nd century BC, Rome is now the big boys on the block. And so they tell Antiochus, you know what? It's time you start paying us taxes. We're going to start collecting taxes and tributes from you to keep you from continuing in your ways, because a greater power had entered the picture, and within a relatively short amount of time, his reign and rule will end. But this prophecy sees something bigger going on. And I point you then to verse 44, but news from the east and the north shall alarm him. And he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. You know who Luther and the Reformers thought this was referring to? The Pope, the Bishop of Rome. And they understood, verse 44, news from the east. Those are the Turks. Those are the Muslims who are sweeping into the Holy Land, who are beginning to conquer Christendom, coming in from the east. And that caused great distress for the Bishop of Rome, who marshaled armies and treasures to try to deal with this, who bribed, who bought off leaders and foreign powers and paid them to help him kind of rule all things. And Luther and the Reformers, the reference to the north, well, what's a little ways north of Rome? A little place called Germany or Saxony. And the Protestant Reformation created great angst for the king who reigned in Rome. And this king was not a pagan outside king. This great leader, who at one point for hundreds of years was the most powerful man on the planet, he resided in Rome. And so the prophecy may well have moved beyond the years, the centuries right before Christ is born. And it may now be describing a new reality for God's people in the world. But still comfort, because it will come to an end. It will come to an end. Now, does this mean that he was the one and only Antichrist? Or he was one of several? Will he be the last one? Will he be the greatest? Only time will tell us. God knows. Certainly, Rome has lost much of its influence. Although Rome would still tell you that the supreme ruler on earth is the Bishop of Rome. Now, they don't make a big deal about it anymore because they know that'll get them in trouble. So they try to play real nice with the other leaders of the world. But, they've lost some of their clout and influence, so they've had to change their tune a little bit. But their theology and their belief is still the same. And if the Bishop of Rome says something, it trumps even what Jesus said. And so there is a would-be king who would usurp the glory of Christ and shine it upon himself. That was one of the problems with Rome in the Reformation. Where did you look to for your hope of salvation? Well, you look to Rome. You look to the Pope. Right? If he said buy an indulgence, you bought an indulgence. If he said go on a pilgrimage, you went on a pilgrimage. If he said venerate a relic, you venerated a relic. Where was Jesus? Almost nowhere to be found. And many times the Antichrist, especially in the New Testament, is described as being within the church. Not an outsider, but somebody within the church, which is really quite scary.
The fight the Catholics are having right now, the American Catholic Church and Rome over excommunication of what you call it, everything, they could split away real easy. But instead of joining the Lutheran Church, because they renounce the Pope and maybe let the priest marry, no, they'll create another Pope. They'll have the American Pope, and they'll just be just as bad as they are now. So, but I see them pulling away because the Pope they got now is super liberal. Most of American Catholics are more conservative, more like Lutherans, Missouri Synod Lutherans.
Yeah, it's and there are other little mentions in here about. I guess it was back in verse 37, or to the one beloved by women. See, the Pope, back when he declared celibacy for priests, was not a hero of women. Because when he initially declared that, he said that priests should leave their wives and children and become and remain celibate from that point on. That's a terrible idea. And it wouldn't have been a real popular move with the ladies. Right? You're taking our husbands, our fathers away from us. But he had the power and the authority to do it. Even though it's not in the Bible.
When did he do that?
No, I don't, Gordon. I want to say like 800 or 900 AD, but I could easily be wrong.
Yeah, I think it was before 1000.
I think so. Yep, that's what my guess is. And before that, understand, they were all married. I mean, priests, cardinals, bishops, they were all married. It's something they invented. They came up with this teaching. So, a very powerful figure. Now, in our day, maybe not quite as powerful, although with more than about half the world's population claiming to be Roman Catholic, he still, in theory, could wield a lot of power. So, the Antichrist, Antichrist, I don't know, but certainly there's a problem with him. Yeah, Bob?
Question, comment, this chapter, 11,
Yep.
Daniel isn't in it, or they don't mention him. He comes back though in chapter 12. So,
Well, actually, 10, 11, and 12 are all part of the one vision.
that prophecy.
Daniel is standing there, and this figure with the bronze body, the waistband, he is speaking to Daniel, telling him all this stuff that is going to happen.
Daniel's age then, would have been what?
Probably about, we think, we're probably in his 80s. No.
87, didn't they say?
I think you had said 89.
Yeah, in late 80s, probably. So and he's getting probably near the end of his life. And this is a biggie. I mean, this vision is big. And we see the impact that it has on him. We already kind of have seen this. And that's often the case with eschatological prophecies. It's like we think, we want to know. It's that movie. What's that movie? You Can't Handle the Truth. Jack Nicholson yelling at Tom Cruise, right? Yeah, you can't handle the truth. If he told us all this stuff, it would be probably too much for us. But he does give us a little insight so that we need not despair. Well, let's go ahead and dive into chapter 12. The last 10 verses of chapter 11, things just kind of blow up. And it's what we believe, and the church has always believed and taught, is an example of telescoping prophecy. Chapter 10, most of chapter 11, pretty clear, fulfilled in the centuries between the time of Daniel and the time of Christ. But beginning with these last 10 verses, the whole thing just kind of blows up. It gets too big. It can't be describing just that. And so at this point, the kind of the telescope of prophecy is seeing beyond that to other things into the future. So with that said, you go to the back of your study guides, and we're going to start with the first 4 chapters.
12, you mean?
Yep. Yeah, all right, what did I say? 12 chapters? Okay.
First,
4 verses, I'm sorry.
The time of the end. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above. And those who turn many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase.
All right. So don't miss how this chapter starts. At that time.
I'm a great
Right?
trouble.
So it builds coming right out of 11. When the events of 11, at the end of 11, when those events are taking place, then Michael, we met Michael earlier, the great archangel charged with protecting God's people. The great archangel will come. There will be trouble unlike any that have ever been. And so people throughout history have been saying, oh, if you look at our world today, there has never been trouble like this. We must be right near the end. Well, we are in the last days because we have been ever since Jesus ascended. So we are in the last days, but is this that great tribulation? Well, I think we all selfishly hope so, because at least then it wouldn't get, then it's already as bad as it's going to get. And we're a little bit afraid of how bad it could get. Well, folks, it could get a whole lot worse. And it got worse for Daniel and the exiles as they were leaving Babylon and going back to Jerusalem, and the troubles they faced and the hardship they faced. And then you have the words about the book, kind of the book of life, and then those who sleep in the dust will be raised. Well, you guys know when that's going to be. So now clearly we are no longer talking about Antiochus and the centuries before Christ came along. Clearly this prophecy has taken Daniel and us all the way through time and all the way to that point right at the last day. And to the great resurrection. And let's see, who will be raised? Do we find that here?
To everything's in the book.
All. Yes, all. See, many people like to believe in heaven. And they figure if they're raised, they're going to get to go to heaven. But they don't really like to believe in a hell, because they figure if they're not good enough to get into heaven, then they'll just stay dead. But that's not what the Bible describes. And we're kind of warned here that there will be a final judgment. God will take care of it. We don't have to worry about it. But on the last day, it will kind of be as if God says, hey, all those of you who didn't want to have anything to do with me, all those of you who were too busy for me, or knew better than I, so you didn't need to listen to my words, all those of you who rejected me, fine. Then you no longer have to be bothered with me. Go off. Be separated from me forever. That is hell. To be separated from the God who is all goodness and the God who is love. That is hell. To be abandoned by the Creator. And yet, there is this judgment, this final judgment. And it doesn't matter on the last day if we all get together and sign a petition and object to the notion of a hell. Ain't going to matter. But God has already given us this glimpse. Not necessarily to scare us, because your names have been written in the book of life, but to comfort and to reassure us. And maybe to scare us a little bit. If we're ever tempted, you know what, God probably wouldn't. No, I'm a pretty good person. He would never send me to hell forever. Yeah, He would. So don't turn your back on God. Don't abandon or give up on God. And so in that respect, yeah, a little bit of fear as well. Let's see. I then provided a piece from the book of Revelation on your little study guide. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough. And they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled into the earth, and his angels with him. This from the Revelation to St. John. And it looks like Satan and the forces of evil are sometimes winning. But they're not. And in the end, they will ultimately be destroyed. And we have this great promise from God. Let's see, did we hear why the rain was cut short? I didn't remember hearing it, but it must be because I put it in as a question. Be delivered, and written, sleep, awake, some pretend those who are wise shall shine. But you, Daniel, shut the many branches. That's probably a bad question. Well, I did provide the text from Matthew. For then there will be great distress, unequal from the beginning of the world until now. Sounds a lot like Daniel, sounds a lot like Revelation. And this is Jesus speaking in Matthew. Never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Those are words of promise. God will not allow the elect to be overthrown. Now, will many be lost? Yes, but not the elect. Not His children. He will preserve them. And we already talked about who will be raised at that time. It's to all the dead. John writes, do not be amazed, for the time of coming when all those who are in the graves will hear His voice and come out. Those who have done good will rise to live, and those who have done evil will rise to be condemned. And then why will the wise shine? Matthew 13 tells us, then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. Understand, those of you with faith, understand how this works. Who are the righteous who will shine like the stars or like the sun? What's that?
Believe.
Believers. Exactly. Yep. Who are the true sons of Abraham? Believers. And what does God liken them to for Abram outside of his tent that night? All the stars in the heaven. Right? Those aren't Jews by ethnicity or by blood. That's what many of the Jews think, and they were wrong. Those are true children of Abraham by faith, who believed. And so, like Father Abraham, it was credited to them as righteousness. Okay, so now let's tackle the last big question. Let's go ahead and read verses 5 through 10, and then we'll pause there for just a moment.
Then I, Daniel, looked, and there before me stood two others, one on this bank of the river and one on the opposite bank. One of them said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long will it be before those astonishing things are fulfilled?
See, he asks the question, when? Right? All these things. So a couple of angels appear. Daniel now sees three figures, a couple of angels and the angel, and one of them says, when is this going to be, God? Now, do you think the angel is really after the answer? Or is the angel setting up God to give an answer for the benefit of all of his people throughout the ages? I would suggest to it's probably the latter. Go ahead, Marvin.
The man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, lifted his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and I heard him swear by him who lives forever, saying, it will be for a time, times and a half a time, when the power of the holy people has been finally broken. All these things will be completed. I heard, but I did not understand. So I asked, my Lord, what will the outcome of all this be? He replied, go your way, Daniel, because the words are closed up and sealed until the time of the end. Many will be purified, made spotless and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand.
Okay. So the big question kind of raised in verse 6 is, when? Or how long? Or when? Now notice, the figure that we had met earlier, the one that had been revealing all this to Daniel, he then takes an oath, basically, on himself, the one who lives forever, the God of all creation. And he gives an answer. Now, it's not the clearest, but he does give an answer. And then I just don't miss it. Does the angel keep pestering him and keep asking? Does the angel say, but that's kind of a vague question, right? Was the angel like one of our modern reporters when they're really after somebody and they keep asking the same and they interrupt? No, this is a different setup. The angel asks a question, probably already knowing the answer, but asks the question so that Daniel and we could hear it from this incredible figure of the vision. And the answer is maybe not what we were expecting or maybe what we were hoping. Who will understand?
Wise. To be wise.
And what is it to be wise in the Old Testament? That mean really smart, having a high ACT, gone to an Ivy League college?
Shut up and listen.
Those who will shut up and listen to God's word. For we're told in Proverbs, and it's echoed in the Psalms, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs tells us, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. But the wise understand. Okay, where does the foolish people build their house?
On rock and rock.
Understand?
Foolish people. Foolish. Yeah, are we going to have to sing? Right, the foolish man built his house upon the sand. Where does the wise man build? On the rock. Not even rock, but the rock. And who is the rock?
Christ.
Christ.
The solid
Exactly.
rock.
Yep.
I stand.
That's where we stand. All other ground? Seas.
I thought that song we talked about.
Yeah. But what of his answer though? There in verse 7. It would be for a time, times, and a half a time. We met that kind of language before. A time, times, and a half a time gives you about 3.5 years. Probably not a literal thing here. Unless it's talking about, you can think about, well, for a time, this is going to happen. This is the first time. And then for times after that, let's say the Roman persecution of Christians in the first 3 centuries, or maybe the persecution and the time of the Pope in his heyday and arrogance. So it's going to be a time and times, but this is not, we can't tell anything. I mean, we don't know when the end is. We don't know what's the time and when the time and a half and when the other is over. We just know there'll be a period. Now there is probably a symbolic meaning to this 3.5, because among the Hebrews, 7 would have been very much a number of completeness. And 3.5 is half of that. And it might be a way of saying, this persecution and this time of trouble will not last forever. It will only last for a specific, shorter period of time, but nothing near complete. So down everything, the world has gone completely to hell. It may seem like it, and it will only, and to be only 3.5 times, somebody has to shorten it. Somebody has to say stop, because it's not complete. Well, who's the one saying stop? God is. He's sovereign. He's in control. If I may paraphrase the figure hovering over the river, don't worry about when. It's going to be a while. And lots of things will happen. But don't worry, because God remains in charge. And you can continue to trust in Him. Well, then let's jump ahead, because we're not quite out of the hard stuff yet. And let's go ahead and read verses 11 and 12, shall we? 11 and 12. Or I'm sorry, 11 through 13, through the end of the chapter.
And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, the abomination that makes desolate is set up, and there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. But go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of days.
Well, now we got to deal with some pretty specific numbers here, don't we? The wise will understand. The foolish will be puzzled and will tirelessly try to figure out. And because they can't understand it, the foolish will conclude that it's not true. Because they can't understand it. You know how much of that we have in our world today? How could God have really flooded the whole earth? I just don't see how that could have been. So they don't believe it. How could everything have been made by God in 6 24-hour days? I don't see how that could happen. So we're not going to believe it. How could it be that this innocent little baby is sinful? We're not going to believe it. And so It's a problem for sinful man. But he says, from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, which happens, I think it was in 160, around 165 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes, he stops the sacrifice in the temple, he brings in the pig, slaughters the pig, which would have defiled the entire temple and would have made it unsuitable for offering sacrifices to Yahweh. So, is that when the sacrifices were stopped? Or was it later in, I think that was 168. In 165, he's coming through, he's still in a bad mood, and then he erects a statue of Zeus in the temple. So which was the abomination of desolation? I don't know. It's hard to say. Now, you might say it doesn't matter, and I'd probably say it probably doesn't. But he does connect it to something happening, and then it's as if that kind of starts the clock ticking. And then he talks about 1,290 days, or what's the other number? 1335.
Days.
And again, take your pick, count forward that many days, and it's come and gone. You see, if this was a literal count until the last day, then Jesus lied. Any moron could do that. Just count that many days from here. I mean, that's not that big of a deal. Now, some have observed that Antiochus dies roughly 3.5 years after, I think it's after this. And so some have said, this is about 3.5 years. This is really close to that kind of whole 3.5 year thing. But other than that, and then temple sacrifice also stopped in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the temple. Jesus had spoken of that shortly before his death, when he wept for Jerusalem and said, if you only knew what was coming. And that was a horrible, horrible time for the Jews in Jerusalem. Besieged and then destroyed. It described it would have been better for women never to have had children than to have endured that period of time. So, is that the abomination of desolation? When the Romans took over, even before, I think it'll be quiet now. Sorry about that. But they set up statues to their gods and put their banners in the temple. So exactly when it is, and it doesn't matter. Pick your poison. Count that many days. That's a long time ago. So it can't be a literal number. It must be a symbolic number. Now again, that's about 3.5 years. And this is a little bit longer than that. So blessed is he who makes it to this day. Let me paraphrase. Blessed is he who endures faithfully to the end, for he will be blessed in the resurrection. So it's got a set period. And a little longer, but don't sweat it. But golly, maybe they meant years. You think that could be? Maybe they meant maybe each day is a year.
Or something else. 100 years or 1,000 years.
Right, or 100 or 1,000, you just keep changing because we don't know. But that would have kind of been that wouldn't have been kind of a normal way of painting the picture. It's a long time when you're struggling, but really it's not all that long. And so what message, now if it's years, well then when is it going to be? If you're starting to count here, we're more than that many years beyond when that happened. Well, so couldn't he have said years, and couldn't he have, well, look, if I say, hey, I want to go show you all something, come hop in the van with me, and we're going to take a little drive. It'll just take us a couple of days and we'll be there. Do you go with me? Probably not, maybe. You might at least consider it. What if I say, hey everybody, come with me, hop in the van, it'll take us a couple of years and then we'll be there. No takers? Probably not. God is trying to comfort his people. You know, how long? He's not telling them when it's going to be. That's not what this is for. It's designed to comfort. And it's a way of saying, I know exactly how long it'll be. And it won't be that long. You can make it. Hang in there. Lo, I am with you always, even to the very end of the age. Neither life nor death, nor principalities nor powers will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. We have all these promises. And so we just want to be very careful about trying to take that literally in any sense of the word. Apocalyptic or eschatological prophecies do not typically use literal references to things. Was there really a leopard with 4 wings that came flying in to conquer the nations? No, that was Alexander the Great. Was there really a beast made of, what was he, gold and bronze and, no, or iron and clay like the Romans? In this type of literature is just not literal, normally. And so these days are probably symbolic. A day being more bearable, 3.5 not being the fullness, so we're not going to be completely destroyed. And then what final lesson does the visitor give Daniel? What does he tell him to do? Or what promise does he make right at the end?
Just, go your way and wait.
Yeah.
Go to hell and wait.
No. Definitely not.
Right, no.
The complaint department,
Your
right?
way.
That's the old complaint department.
Yeah.
The head of our complaint department is Mrs. Wade, Helen. So if you have a complaint, go to Helen Wade. First off, I meant to mention this earlier. They tell Daniel to seal this book up. In our ears, it might sound like they seal it up, keep it a secret, don't let anybody know what's in it. The instructions are probably the opposite. The instructions are seal it up in a book, keep it safe, protect it. This word is for future generations beyond which you can even imagine. And so in the 1940s or 1950s, when they uncovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found all these scrolls sealed up in vessels to protect them and to keep them. So this would have been an ancient way of saying, write it down, put it in a safe place, so that future generations can hear them as well. These words weren't just for Daniel. They were for all his people. And so the words at the very end, a promise. Go your way till the end, and you shall rest, and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of days. Right? So be thou faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. That's your allotted space. You are among the elect. I don't care how much trouble you see. You are among the elect, and I will deliver you. Not one will be lost. And that's really a glorious promise for Daniel to kind of wrap up a vision that would have been a tough one to kind of stomach and fully appreciate. All right. Any other questions or comments? I probably don't have answers, but yeah, Marvin?
Back in verse 7, the last two sentences, verse 7, chapter 12.
Uh-huh.
Says, when the power of the holy people has been finally broken, all these things will be completed. What do you think that means? Or did I miss it? The power of the holy people.
Probably be easiest to appreciate in the time of the Reformation, because for many hundreds of years, the main power on the planet was the church. It was the holy people. I mean, the holy people had most of the power, and during that period of time, the leaders of the church were not shy about claiming for themselves civil, political, military power as well. But the time will come when that power will all evaporate. I can't help but think about how, President Obama a number of years ago had said that we are no longer a Christian nation. And I fear he's right, and that's sad. But as a Christian nation, the United States had a fair amount of power, and they also had a fair amount of moral authority. Well, I think we're losing that. Or I think in many ways we've lost a big chunk of it. And many commentators take that verse to mean when the when the civil or the temporal power of the holy people have come to nothing. Right? So the church is nothing. The church has been trampled. Right? People mock it, make fun of it. That's when the power of God's holy people have come to nothing. Well, before they're lost, God will intercede. There's an interesting parallel with that. When Jesus triumphed, his greatest triumph, what was his power level? In Jesus' greatest triumph, he had so humbled himself that no one would have ever looked at that figure on the cross and said, whoa, there's a powerful dude. I mean, they would have said, he's lost, he's a loser, he's been defeated, everything he stood for is done. And yet, those of us who have been given the eyes of faith, we see something quite different. The wise will understand. What you guys tell me, if we could somehow wave a magic wand and give to all of the presidents and vice presidents of our Synod almost infinite power, would that be a good thing? No. You guys didn't have to think about it. You knew instinctively with power for human beings, corruption, and absolute corruption, and really bad. When is the church at its finest? Probably when she's persecuted. When are some of the most glorious moments of the church? Easter morning, when it's packed with people, or on those days when 2 or 3 show up with broken hearts, looking to God for help. That's glory. Think about it. What do we all get excited about? Easter and Christmas. Because we pack the doors. When one sinner repents, there is more joy in heaven. And we just, it's our natural way of looking at it. We can't help ourselves. And I'm not saying having church full is a bad thing. Don't misunderstand. But when we talk about when the Holy One's power comes to naught, what's probably in mind there or in me there is their civil or their temporal power. A broken and contrite heart, God will not despise. But what will he do to the haughty or the proud heart? He will bring them down. And so I think that's kind of part of what's probably illustrated here. Yeah. All right. Well, gang, that's all I had. Prophecy is challenging. Eschatological or apocalyptic prophecy is a double or triple challenge. But this is exactly, well, this is very much like much of the book of Revelation. So maybe after a little break we can dive into that sometime too.
Any other places besides Daniel and Revelation?
There are hints of it, but not really.
I mean, in poetry and
I mean,
and
Jesus talks a little bit about the end times, and he does it in parable. So it's a little bit different. But certainly Revelation and Daniel, those are the clearest examples. I think possibly in the Apocrypha, you might see a little more of it. But in the Bible, these are the main spots. These are the main spots. All right. Well, then let's close with a word of prayer. O good and gracious Heavenly Father, you have invited us to pray, to talk to you as beloved children would a loving Father. But we are also reminded by our study of Daniel that you are the one and only true and sovereign God. You rule all things, and you have set the times and allotted for all the things that go on in our world. And you remain in control at all times. You have warned us that the future will bring tough times and some persecution, at times worse than others. But in the end, much of the world is aligned against you and your people. That is our privilege, to be counted as one of your people. Never let us forget your incredible promises to always be with us, to see us through all things, and that even in the midst of trial and persecution, help us to view it as being refined and made stronger and pure. Help us to cling to your word, for in your word we find faith and sight and wisdom and knowledge. Help us to never be too smart for our own good, but to always lean on your word and on your Son, our Savior, and on your faith-creating and maintaining Spirit, and help us to trust that no matter what may come our way, the time here in this reality will one day and soon come to an end, and we can look forward to the plans you have for us for all eternity. We don't deserve it, and yet you've made us one of your own. For that, O Lord, thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right.